We of the staff could not take a moment's rest, for we had to study maps and receive orders. We were going to take up quarters at Jablonica. We went ahead to prepare them. Our maps were not bad, but as the Russians had built new roads during the war, we lost our way twice. People of whom we asked directions would not open their mouths, and looked as though they were making fun of us. Our dear allies even refused to give us water. The roads were wretched. We had to carry our bicycles, sinking up to our knees in sand. Because a battalion of the 118th Infantry and a hospital unit had preceded us, we could find no quarters for our men. It was all we could do to hunt out a place to house Ager, who did not like to sleep in the open. The place we found for him was an unbelievably filthy hovel, where about 10 persons, men, women and children, slept in a single room, all jumbled together in 2 beds filled with straw. A frightful, musty odour greeted us. A number of chickens ran unmolested around the wee, opened doors and windows, and began to clean up a bit, and chased the chickens out. A woman brought us sheets and fresh straw, and sent the family away. She only consented to this on the condition that she would be well paid, but she is still waiting for her money. Ager made a face when he saw his quarters. In spite of the airing, the smell was awful. These people were accustomed to live on dung heaps, and this explains why there were not more epidemics. Moreover, wherever we went in Galicia, it was the same. The people were repulsively dirty and covered with lice. Ager, Rickert, Loffelhart and I had to sleep in this hovel. When we went in, we found a young man and woman sleeping in our bed. Ager chased them out. The rest of the family were lying on tables. 2 old women slept on straw mattresses in front of the fireplaces. We could not close an eye all night for lack of air, and because of the cooties, which did not give us a moment's peace. On the following day, we saw one of the women carefully inspecting the head of another woman. In answer to our question, she said she was looking for lice. We had obtained permanent guests during that night in the hovel. These new companions did not leave us during our entire stay on the Eastern Front. At 10 o'clock, we left for Jaslo. The battalion's march was very fatiguing, for the men were continually sinking into the sand. Rickert, Loffelhart and I, who had gone ahead on horseback, met the famous General Mackensen, whose quarters were about 2 kilometers away. All the troops along the road cheered him. He passed by without saying anything, as though he were weary of hearing soldiers shout. The Russians had blown up the great railroad bridge at the southern entrance of the village. The troops crossed the Wistoka over a pontoon bridge, built by our engineers. In order to proceed more rapidly, we found a ford which our horses could cross easily enough. The Jaslo station was completely destroyed. We could not tell whether by the Russians or the Austrians themselves. In any case, it had not been done by those Russians who had just evacuated the town about 4 days ago, because we could see that the work had been done long before. The Galicians who stayed behind did not speak very badly of the Russians, except the Jews, who told frightful tales but at the same time seized the opportunity to cheat us terribly whenever we bought anything of them. As the inhabitants did not understand German, we talked to them by means of signs. Rickert got down on all fours to show that he wanted a stable. On May 10th we rejoined the rest of the division. The 188th led, followed by the 88th Infantry and the 111th and 112th Artillery. The 35th Infantry brought up the rear. An Austrian regiment was marching along. Some of these men shouted insults. "Cowards," answered our soldiers. "You've gotten a good licking from the Russians, and now we've had to come to your help in this dirty country, full of lice." The officers forbade the men quarrelling with the Austrians. Columns of Russian prisoners were also going along the same road. Them said to his men, "Rog, upon seeing, do me the favour of letting those pigs carry your knapsacks, and you take their tobacco and cigarettes." In an instant the soldiers had obeyed his order. There were many wounded among the Russian prisoners. Everywhere the roads were in a terrible state, and the men, weighed down by their knapsacks, advanced painfully slowly, sinking in the sand. Ager spoke harshly to them, saying that they weren't making rapid enough progress. He even threatened to cut down their rations. Howls of protest and cries of anger were heard among the soldiers. "Pack of thieves!" they all yelled at once. "As it is, we've got almost nothing to eat, because you take all the best stuff, And now you're shooting off your mouths because you're on horseback and we've got to carry our knapsacks while we trudge along in the sand. But one day the war'll be over, and then we'll see who'll be the boss, who'll be the bravest then." Ager was furious and spurred his horse on the men, holding his crop aloft and wounding one man with it. Nevertheless, and although they all hated him, no one dared move to give Ager a lesson. Roger, whom he told about the whole affair, approved of it and said, "Those pigs need a bullet in their hides. It's a regular mutiny. The beasts don't even deserve to fall in battle." On hearing this, we wondered who did deserve to fall in battle, for it was a well-known fact that Roger never ventured in a place where he might be under fire. German newspapers reported that the Galicians had been maltreated by the Russians. We saw that this was absolutely false. During the 6 months of the Russian occupation, everything was peaceful. The fields were cultivated and everything was ready for the harvest. It was the Germans, the so-called liberators, who on the contrary destroyed everything. And so the Galicians were very displeased that we had come to rid them of the Russians. Soldiers offered women rings and jewellery stolen in France if they would give themselves up to them. Roger himself ordered a good-looking young woman to be brought to him for the night, saying, "What has been done by the Russians can be done over again by the Germans." Ager was certainly a tyrant and a brute, but he never showed himself to be the coward and satyr that Roger was. Such conduct only served to spur on the soldiers who followed women into the churches where they had taken refuge. The Galicians will never forget their liberators. The Jews never missed a chance to rob us and always asked exorbitant prices for the goods they offered. In order to trick us, the better they began by flattering us, saying, "Oh, what brave and generous soldiers the Germans are! Oh, how great and good your emperor is! How happy we are that you've delivered us from the Russians! The whole world admires the Germans." But some soldiers who wanted a certain object did not hesitate to take it without paying, if the Jews asked too big a price. In such cases, Ager always sided with his men. "You damned dirty Jews," he said to the merchants who complained to him, "how dare you cheat Prussian soldiers?" The Jews had the cheek to answer, "Captain, the Russians have robbed us, so that we must sell our goods a little higher in order not to go bankrupt." Ager was furious, and ordered them to be off at once, or he would have them beaten by the soldiers. The children of Abraham departed hurriedly. Ager formally authorized his soldiers to take anything they wished without paying for it, if they thought the Jews were asking exorbitant prices. One can easily understand that the soldiers no longer refrained from stealing. On June 15, 1915, we were quartered at Albigawa, where we were to stay 2 days to make our final preparations for going into the first-line trenches. But at 4 a.m. we were ordered to leave immediately for Markawa, where we would find the general staff of the division. 4 hours later we found there the following order signed by the Lieutenant General commanding the 56th Division. "The 88th Infantry will march at the head of the 56th Division. No precautions must be neglected because the regiment is about to meet the enemy. I hope that the regiment will do its duty here as it has done it in France. I count absolutely on the brave and heroic soldiers of the 88th. This order is to be read." The horrors of war were to begin again, for we left in the direction of the San and passed through the village of Przeworsk, where there were a great many wounded, for a fierce struggle had just taken place. Since most of our German horses had fallen owing to the heat and the bad roads, we had replaced them by little Russian ponies, which were much hardier. In spite of the battle, the inhabitants had chosen to remain behind. The Russians, during the entire time of their occupation of Galicia, had devastated nothing and had scrupulously respected persons and property, but we and the Austrians were now laying waste all the country. Dr. Meinecker said to us, "It's not surprising that these people hate us. Just consider. The Russians did not touch their houses, their gardens, or their fields. We, on the contrary, destroy everything. In the houses and villages from which the Russians had just retired, I did not see any trace of pillage as in France and Belgium. After all, these people have a right to complain about us. Doctor, we're going to show these slavish pigs, these lice-infested peasants, what stuff war is made of. We who have fought the Russians and French will force them to go down on their knees to us for a piece of bread. If I ask one of these brutes for a drink and get no response, I strike him across the face with my crop. I'll show them what a Prussian soldier is." No one said a word because Eger could brook no contradiction. He was a real Prussian, after Kaiser Wilhelm's own heart. At 6 o'clock we were 18 kilometers to the north of Jaroslav and on the banks of the San. The day before, the Russians had retreated, leaving their unburied dead behind. The struggle must have been desperate, and no mercy shown, for the skulls of many of the dead had been smashed by musket blows. We crossed the San on a bridge built by our engineers. Hardly had we reached the other side when Rogge ordered us to form in skirmish line. That was foolish, for as yet we had no idea where the enemy was, and we didn't even know if we were to attack him. Rogge assembled the officers in back of a little hill and addressed them as follows. "At last we are going to match ourselves against the Russians. I hope, gentlemen, that you will exert yourselves to the utmost to spare us the shame of defeat. During the combat, I ask you to keep in close touch with me, so that I can from time to time give you the divisional orders. Captain Eger with the 2nd Battalion will advance against the enemy, about 6 or 7 meters in front of the rest. The 1st Battalion will be on his right and the 118th on his left. Captain Radke with the 3rd Battalion will remain with me in reserve. Now, gentlemen, good luck to you." Loffelhart and I handed our horses to our orderlies and took our bicycles, in order to carry orders of which the soldiers were to know nothing. It was 7 p.m. We were advancing on the village of Wiezonica, which we were to attack from the left. Hardly had we arrived within 3 meters of the village, when we were greeted by machine gun fire, which did us no harm, however, because the aim was very bad. Eger ordered a rest and telephoned Rogge for instructions, but got no answer, so he had us advance again, and many of us were killed and wounded. Seeing that we would gain nothing, Eger again stopped our advance. I stayed with him, Rickert and Loffelhart, in a sand pit, to which some soldiers a little later brought Lieutenant Dauchet of the 8th Company. He had a bullet in his abdomen and seemed to be suffering intensely. He begged us to kill him. We had no means of affording him any relief. He died a little while afterwards. When the battle was over, Eger had him buried on the banks of the river. Eger, not knowing what to do, sent me with Loffelhart and a first-class private to Rogge for instructions. Bullets whizzed all around us. We started to crawl, and finally landed in the midst of the 2nd Company. They had been without a word from their battalion for 4 hours. A young reserve officer said boldly that Rogge had shown himself absolutely incapable of commanding his regiment. Finally, we found Rogge's adjutant, Lieutenant von Stein, who, without listening to us, said that the orders were to take Wiezonica at 2 o'clock. We extracted a written and signed order from him, because this young fellow was quite capable of issuing such instructions on his own responsibility to distinguish himself and so get the Iron Cross of the 1st class. We promptly returned to Eger, who immediately ordered the battalion to hold itself in readiness to attack. We advanced without a single shot being fired at us. A patrol that had gone ahead returned to say that the town was heavily fortified. We told Rogge of this, and he said nothing. Eger then ordered us to attack, and to our great surprise we entered the town without a single shot being fired at us, and without finding a single Russian soldier there. The enemy had retreated. Such was the capture of Wiezonica, which was the subject of a magnificent communiqué, and which all the German newspapers celebrated as a great victory of the 56th Division. The soldiers all laughed and made fun of us, and above all of Rogge, who had not even yet arrived on the scene. So afraid and distrustful was he of the Russians. Towards 10 o'clock we took possession of the Russian trenches, which led from the town to the river Lubatzauka. Hardly were we settled there when we were ordered to return to the town. Everyone thought that our officers did not know what to do, and were embarrassed. Suddenly the first Russian shell hit us, killing about 6 men. As Rogge had announced that we would not resume our march for another hour, we had time to bury our dead. "Give no quarter," said Eger in the speech that he made on this occasion. "This band of beasts deserves no pity. If you let yourselves be captured, you will have to work in the mines of Siberia, with your feet in chains." Punctually at 1 o'clock, our artillery opened fire. Our gunners aimed well, and we were able to advance, pipes in our mouths and arms shouldered without the slightest difficulty. Lieutenant Schala, who was a forester by profession, advanced calmly, guns slung over his shoulder as if he were off for a hunt. The Russians were massacred in these woods by our shells, and later we found their dead and wounded. It had been a veritable carnage. The battle was now practically won, but we still had to capture Radowa to prevent the enemy from attacking our flank. Lieutenant Nell, at the head of a patrol that had only to fire a few shots, took the town. Its only defenders were a few Cossacks who retreated at a gallop. Ijer, who was in command, had chosen the best house in the town for us. As we were settling ourselves there in his absence, an officer of the Uhlans, who was adjutant of the 35th Infantry, came in, and addressing himself to Löffelhardt, asked us to get out and make room for him. Löffelhardt explained to him that these were Eger's quarters, and that the latter was in command of the town. "Shut your damned mouth," cried the trooper. "You fool, a 1-year volunteer? You think I'm going to sleep in a hovel full of peasants while you lounge about this beautiful house? Get out, away with you, and the quicker the better." But Löffelhardt shook his head at the Uhlan, who disappeared, furious, only to return a few moments later accompanied by an elderly colonel. "Where is that blackguard?" said he on entering, and his eyes sought Löffelhardt. I took a hand. "What do you want?" roared the old colonel. I tried to explain to him that we had been the first to arrive, and that it was our place because the battalion was actually in the town, while the 35th had only reached its outskirts. "I see," said the colonel. "You are in league with this wretch." Things were beginning to look serious for us when Eger arrived on the scene. As he never was afraid of anything, he explained the affair to the colonel, who went away leaving his adjutant to disentangle himself as best he could. Hardly had he gone when Eger, who did not have too much patience, said to him, "What are you doing here, and why did you make so much noise in my house? Do you think that you are in your stable? Get out of here and quickly, or I'll have you put out by my men." The brave Uhlan did not dare answer Eger, and left like a whipped dog. Eger told us that we should have kicked him out ourselves and showed him what proper treatment was. We had a good meal with Eger, but could not close an eye all night because of the coyotes. The suffering those creatures caused us while we were in Galicia was perfectly incredible. The next day we repaired to the woods called Radowa, leaving the town of that name behind. We wandered about, first to the right, then to the left. Apparently our officers did not know what to do. In the evening we returned to the town for food. Then the battalion encamped at the edge of the woods. During this time the 35th threw up defences along the Lubotjoka to prevent the Russians from crossing. The Lubotjoka is a little river that empties into the San at Monasters. We were to stay in this position for several days without advancing. On the 20th we began to dig trenches in the woods. Our men cut down great quantities of trees for dugouts. They were officially forbidden to destroy things wantonly in Galicia, but the truth is that the German officers did exactly what they liked in Galicia, and to the Galicians and all the Austrians in general. During the night of May 21st, we left the woods to occupy an excellent position between Radowa and Monasters. We were well sheltered there, and only about 20 metres from the river where the soldiers could bathe. Unfortunately, and it was the case during our entire sojourn on the Eastern Front, the provisioning of the soldiers was badly managed, and the soldiers often complained of not having enough to eat. Where were the chickens and the good wines of France? Rickert, who had charge of provisioning the battalion, came to Eger one day and said, "I noticed some cattle on a farm 500 metres from here. The owners refused to sell them. How shall I get meat?" Eger, delighted, immediately gave orders to seize the cattle. Lieutenant Bortger, Löffelhardt and I were ordered to accompany Rickert with several men on this very noble errand. We went into the backyard of the farm, where several women and children were gathered. With tears in their eyes, they implored us to leave them their cattle, which constituted their entire fortune. Without them, they said, they would surely all die of hunger. "What nonsense!" cried Lieutenant Bortger. "We'll take 4 cows, 1 for each company, and a 5th for the regimental staff. Come, men, hurry and be sure to choose the fattest ones." The soldiers hastened to obey, but the poor women fell on their cows as if they were their children threatened by danger. It was impossible to loosen their hold. It became a veritable battle. The frightened cows ran into their backyard, dragging the clinging women along with them. The angry soldiers, encouraged by us, bullied the women and kicked them about. One of the latter held her hand clasped to her breast, as though trying to hide something in her blouse. Bortger, perceiving this, commanded us to search her. We were scarcely able to make her let go of the beast, one of whose horns she was holding with her other hand. Bortger and Rickert, one, drew their revolvers and threatened to kill her. By Lieutenant Nolter's order, he having also joined our expedition, the soldiers tore every stitch from the unfortunate woman, and there she stood quite naked before us all. Then we saw that it was a crucifix that she held, clasped fiercely to her breast. The soldiers, on seeing a naked woman, let go the cattle and came to amuse themselves about the hapless creature who was crying from shame. Bortger and Nolter then began to spit on this woman's body, while Adjutant Hoffmann of the 8th Company and several soldiers closed round her and touched her with their dirty hands. It was only at the end of an interval that the woman was permitted to dress. "What say you, Nolter?" said Bortger. "It certainly was funny. What a lovely picture. This Rickert had been a theological student. I shall never forget it. I nearly died laughing." "Too bad all the soldiers were there," answered Nolter. "Otherwise I should have—" Bortger was to forget that scene sooner than he thought, as he was killed on the next day, May 23rd, 1915. He was buried behind the trenches without a single word of regret being spoken over his grave. At the moment that the body was being lowered, First-Class Private Bender took off Bortger's leggings, because the latter owed him some money. On the 24th, between 6 and 7 o'clock, we suddenly heard the Russians hurrahing in their trenches. Thinking that they were about to attack us, our artillery sent them a shower of shells. They still continued their yelling and even began to sing. We did not understand what was happening, when suddenly the singing stopped, and in the midst of the silence a loud voice shouted, "Brothers, Italy has declared war on Austria. You had better surrender, as all resistance is henceforth useless." This was not joyful news for the German soldiers. They said it was a diplomatic failure, etc. But Eger told them to have no fear, because the Italians were cowards, incapable of serious fighting, and that soon the Austrians would be in Venice. To annoy the Russians, the men were ordered to sing Deutschland über alles and Die Wacht am Rhein. That evening, May 23rd, was of the pleasantest of the war for us, as the Russians and Germans both sang all through it, one from joy, the other out of spite. On the 24th, Captain Lindworm, who had been slightly wounded at Lenglier and had since succeeded in staying in hiding in Mayence, returned to his regiment and, being older than Eger, took command of the 2nd Battalion. The latter took command of the 10th Company. No one regretted his departure, but his successor was one of the greatest cowards in the army. Lindworm, who had not yet been in the trenches, was horribly afraid of catching the cooties. He did not dare eat with us nor touch anything that we had handled. He always spoke to us from a distance of 5 or 6 feet. He made fun of us, called us lousy fellows, and was ever so proud of being clean himself. Loffelhart and I tried our best to make him catch some of the dirty little creatures, but always in vain, as we could not get near him. But at last Loffelhart had an ingenious idea. We put a few of these insects into a matchbox, and during his absence put it, half opened, into his bed, and awaited the result. By the next day we knew that we had succeeded. Lindworm asked us to dinner with him, a new and unheard of thing. "There is no use in isolating myself any longer, because some day I'll catch these fleas anyway," said he. "It seems to be quite inevitable." It was funny to see him scratching first his arms, then his throat and legs, all during the meal. "Gentlemen," said he at last, "I think that I have caught the damned things, though I don't know how it could have happened. I've been so careful to use insect powder all the time." Then we showed him why the powder was of no use at all. A flea buried under a speck of powder would emerge from it as fresh and gay as ever. After that evening we occupied this position until June 4th. At our left was the 98th Imperial and Royal Austrian Regiment. One day a soldier from this regiment came to our staff and asked permission to speak to the commander of the battalion about a matter of importance. Eger was then in command during Lindworm's abhere, is what the soldier said to him. Some Russian prisoners of ours told us that their regiments are going to attack us this evening in order to retake the town. However, all of my comrades, who are mostly Bohemians and Czechs, have decided to make no resistance but to surrender, as they have had enough of war. The officers have also decided to give themselves up, for they know what's going on, although they have said nothing. But I am a German Austrian from Vienna, and I don't want to see it all end this way. That is why I come to warn you what those dirty Slovaks are planning to do. Eger immediately telephoned for reinforcements. The 92nd Brunswicks were immediately sent to us. Our artillery was ordered to fire on the Austrians if they retreated. The 92nd was to do the same. The Russians attacked at the hour that our informant had promised, and as they advanced, the Austrians began their retreat. But we were prepared for that very contingency. While Lieutenant Huck of the 5th Company of our regiment advanced against the Russians, our artillery and the 92nd Brunswicks started shooting at the Austrians, who, on finding themselves between two fires, began to advance again. If the Russians had been able to hold their town, our entire battalion would have been captured. On the following day, the Austrians were replaced by German troops at the request of the commandant of our division. Our officers spat in disgust at the Austrians, and the men did likewise. During the night of June 3rd, we abandoned our position to go to a bend in the Lubotzoka to the right of Radowa. On the 4th at 8 o'clock, we were to open the general offensive, which was to put us in possession of the other bank of the river and drive the Russians out of Galicia. Everything was ready. We had an excellent bomb thrower in our trenches, and a captain of the 111th Artillery who was with us to time the firing, thanks to his telephonic instructions, too far to the right, too far to the left, too near, too far, helped marvellously. This bomb thrower was a small cannon, about the size of a German machine gun. The gunner aimed, pushed the lever, and the bomb mounted into the air with a sort of grumbling sound. It carried in the neighbourhood of 400 metres, and on bursting destroyed everything within a radius of about 30 metres. The explosion was accompanied by a cloud of heavy black smoke, which took several moments to disappear. The Russians, demoralized by our artillery, surrendered themselves in a body. The captain told us that had we had the French to fight, things might have turned out differently for us, and that many of us would have fallen, as the latter were good fighters and knew how to defend themselves. Toward 10 o'clock, the Russians had to draw on their reserves. The 6th Company was isolated for a while, and might easily enough have been captured. During the fight, Lindworm, scared silly, had hidden in his dugout. When it became necessary for him to rejoin us, he had himself surrounded by 6 soldiers who served as a shield. This cowardliness did not prevent him from shortly becoming commander. A little later we had to attack in order to get possession of the hill in front of us, and so continue to drive back the Russians. Also captured the woods to the right of the hill. During all this time, no one saw Lindworm. Rickert, Loffelhart, and I had all the responsibility. Without too great loss, the battalion rapidly obtained all its objectives. Until June 7th, we occupied the line from Gady to Zaradawa, and then we continued our advance. During all this time, food reached us irregularly and in insufficient quantities. On the 10th, we were in Dobra. The famished soldiers began to pillage the houses. Lindworm was the first to approve of this. On the 11th, we were the reserves in a wood north of Rudka. On the 12th, we were relieved. We then went to Rudka for our next orders. Our march was very painful. At Rudka, we received bread, eggs, milk, butter and cheese. We sat down to eat without waiting for Lindworm, who was never about. He had spent the night in a hole that a child could hardly have crept into. Just imagine a man with a paunch sleeping in a cradle. Such was the spectacle that the brave Prussian captain presented. It was hard for us not to burst out laughing when we saw him. As the Russians were still retreating, we dug a sufficiently large shelter and asked Lindworm to join us. But he was paralyzed with fright and would not move, but remained where he was, occasionally scratching himself on account of the fleas. Out of pity for him, we dug a trench between his hole and ours, so that he could join us without exposing himself. He almost wanted to kiss us and could not thank us enough. On the next day we went to Dobza. The Russian artillery fire was intense. Lindworm commanded the sections to advance on the run, but far from setting the example himself, he remained on his belly in a trench. How could the soldiers be brave when their commander was such a coward? At Dobza, he had the impertinence to rebuke Lieutenant Scharler for having exposed us all to the enemy's fire by crossing the open field with his company. Scharler answered with some irony that he had quite forgotten to ask the Russians not to fire while Commander Lindworm passed. Everyone knew that our own rations were in truth insufficient. Anyway, the Bavarians made a practice of butchering their wounded and prisoners. A Bavarian lieutenant himself said that he gave no quarter. "It is serious warfare, war to the knife," said he, "and I want to see blood flow." From Kawale we proceeded to Cisplis. We spent a bad half-hour ascending a little hill where the Russians bombarded us heavily. The 7th and 8th Companies had many casualties and lost nearly all of their privates. Sergeant Major here was wounded in the neck and lost his right arm. We were now under a general who commanded a Bavarian army corps. We were ordered to take the village of Wolozasby. Lindworm, following his usual custom, stayed behind with the telephone, and it was up to us to lead the battalion. We took the village without very great difficulty or heavy losses. In the evening, Rickert and I went to look for Lindworm, who, as I have said, had been out of sight the entire day. When we told him that we were in possession of the town, he had the audacity to say to us proudly, "I am happy to be in command of so noble a battalion, and I thank you, my friends, for assisting me so splendidly in the execution of my orders." When we were alone again, on entering the village we noticed a Russian captain at the edge of the road. He was wounded and apparently in agony. We went up to him to see whether we could do anything for him. He had several bayonet wounds and had almost lost consciousness. As we raised his head, he opened his eyes and said, "Away with you, assassins! Why do your men commit such awful crimes? I was no longer an enemy when I surrendered with my company. Unarmed, we were all massacred. At least blow out my brains so that I may no longer suffer." We called the nurses and left him. Afterwards, the nurses told us that they had ended his sufferings as it had been impossible to move him. In any event, we knew that he had spoken the truth because we saw the Russian muskets piled up 50 meters behind the place where we had found him and his butchered men. We occupied the Russian trenches until June 19th. Our staff was magnificently installed in a church where we had had fresh straw brought. A telephone installed in the sacristy enabled us to keep informed of all that happened in the trenches. On June 20th, we were ordered to seize the village of Dornach, scarcely 15 kilometers from the Russian frontier. Lindworm made a wry face on hearing this. He told us that it was very easy for those gentlemen in the rear, well protected as they were, to give like orders. "Captain," we said to him, "why do you not have yourself placed on the general's staff? Haven't you proved that you can direct a battle lying hidden in a wheat field? You've been an adjutant for 12 years and know quite as much as a colonel." Lindworm answered, shrugging his shoulders, "I've tried everything, but it's no use. They don't want me." The taking of Dornach was easier than we had thought. We found many dead there, besides dying horses and a lot of damaged material. One man had had his chest run through by a wagon pole. We also found 3 Russian soldiers killed by bayonet thrusts and stripped naked. Even their boots had been carried off. The inhabitants of the village had fled, and numbers of frightened cattle were running all over the place. Rickert seized 8 calves and had them killed for our battalion, just the members of the staff. Dirig, our cook, was delighted. The extraordinary thing was that we ate the 8 calves in 2 days. There were only about 14 of us, including the cook and the orderlies. It is true that we kept eating it all day long and without bread, and that it was a long time since we had had anything so delicious. But still, I never would have believed that one could eat so much meat. On June 22nd, the rumour was about that we would soon be replaced by a division of the 11th Army Corps. That very same evening, indeed, we were relieved by the 44th Brigade of this corps. We left for Chokau, then for Olesiu, where we were quartered. The city was full of Jews who sold vodka, an alcoholic beverage so strong that all the soldiers became drunk. On the 24th, we reached Polank, which had been almost completely destroyed by the Germans. Roger installed himself in a house that happened not to have been damaged, putting its inmates, including an old woman who was ill and in her bed, into the street. In the evening, he had the regiment's band play. On the 26th, we went to Jaroslaw, where we were to entrain to be killed elsewhere. We changed all of our wagons, but kept our little Russian ponies, which we were to take to France, for it was to France that we were returning after 2 months' absence. Our train went through Lankut and Krakow, where we were given food. At last, on a Sunday, at 5 o'clock, we reached the German frontier of Poland. A disinfecting plant had been put up so that we could at last get rid of our vermin. Everything had to pass through this establishment: men, horses, wagons, even the kitchens. Each man made separate packages of his cloth and of his leather clothing. These packages were numbered for identification and handed in to be returned to us later. There we stood in our shirts. Then they took us to tanks in which we plunged into hot water up to our necks. We soaped and scrubbed one another with a special soap which killed the lice and their eggs. Only then could we realize the damage these dirty little beasts had done. Some of the men's bodies looked like open sores. Then we had cold showers, and each of us got a fresh shirt and a pair of drawers and socks. These had been requisitioned in France and Belgium. They were of every imaginable colour. One man wore a pair of blue drawers, a red shirt and yellow socks. Another had on a pink shirt, green drawers and black or white socks. In this outfit we went into a room where a meal was served us. It looked more like a masquerade than war, and all the soldiers were very gay. Then we received back our clothes and leather garments, which had all been submitted to a high temperature in a special furnace. Naturally, they were in a frightful condition, but we were happy to be rid of our vermin. Our journey from Galicia to France lasted 5 days. July 1st, 1915. We reached Brussels, where we stayed for several hours. When we were crossing Germany, the people had cheered us everywhere, but here no one noticed us. July 2nd, we were at Valenciennes, 4 kilometres from the town. Our battalion was quartered at Herin, where we rested for quite a while from the effects of the campaign in Galicia. Lindworm and Rickert were lodged in a castle. Loffelhart and I found a place for ourselves in a small house where a woman and 2 children lived. All the 7th and 8th companies were billeted. The 5th and 6th were quartered in the big breweries, those of Sauvage and Giran. The men behaved themselves well, and there were no complaints. The entire 56th Division was at Valenciennes and in the vicinity. The staff office of the division was at Saint-Saulve with a motorcycle company. The staff office of the regiment and of the 3rd Battalion was at Valenciennes itself. A company of machine guns was encamped between Herin and Aubry, continually on the watch for French and English aviators flying over the town. The 111th Artillery Corps with its ammunition. Train was at Aubry. All the cannon had been sent to Douai, where there was a huge repair shop. We had few duties, for the division was there to recuperate. On the 9th, our general held a big review and distributed the decorations awarded by Emperor Francis Joseph to our soldiers who had fought in Galicia. Lindworm was decorated by the general, who congratulated him on his excellent leadership in Austria. The soldiers grumbled, and Sanzler, a non-commissioned officer of the 6th Company, said in a loud voice, We are the ones who did the fighting. We carry the scars of battle, but the cowards are decorated.